Hi. Thank you all so much for coming tonight to this event from Staten Island to Palestine, resisting Israel's influence on militarized policing. I also want to thank Dr. ROBYN SPENCER and Linda Sarsour for joining us tonight. We're really very honored that you could be here with us. We're here tonight during a historic moment, both in the debate surrounding racial justice and police brutality in the United States, and on the issue of justice for Palestinians living in the occupied Palestinian territories. In the wake of the violence of this past summer against unarmed Black civilians here in New York City and unarmed Palestinian civilians in Israel and Palestine, it is more important than ever that we recognize the parallels between the injustices faced by communities of color in New York and by Palestinians in the occupied territories, and that we work to dismantle the connections between the New York City Police Department and the Israeli government. As the NYPD's racial profiling and predatory policing grows more severe, we find ourselves in the midst of a national crisis of militarized policing. We cannot forget that this violence is amplified by the Israeli military-industrial complex. Despite the fact that the international community has repeatedly condemned the Israeli government for its violations of human rights, including operating an apartheid regime, the targeting of Palestinian children and nonviolent activists, punitive home demolitions, and the mistreatment and torture of Palestinians detained without due process in Israel's military court system, NYPD officers travel to Israel to receive trainings in and from Israeli security forces. Meanwhile, the Israeli government enjoys a wide range of special privileges in developing military and surveillance weapons for Israeli and U.S. police and militaries. Such surveillance technology is then used in the discriminatory surveillance of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities here in New York. And weapons that are tested in the West Bank and Gaza are used on our streets in the United States. It is clear that the movement for racial justice in the United States is inseparable from the movement for justice in Israel and Palestine, and we're honored to have ROBYN and Linda here to discuss these issues. We're very excited to hear from ROBYN and Linda tonight. ROBYN SPENCER is an assistant professor of history at Lehman College with a focus on 20th century civil rights movements, African American studies, and urban history. She traveled to the West Bank in 2014 as part of a Black delegation and curates a Tumblr called Black on Palestine. She's currently working on a book about the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. Tonight, we're going to hear from ROBYN on the history of race and policing and on solidarity and connections between today's anti-police brutality activism here in the United States and the Palestinian liberation movement. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask ROBYN to start us off.
Okay, so I wanted to start off by saying, as was mentioned in the introduction, that this time last year, I was on a delegation to Palestine with about 10 other African Americans. We traveled throughout the West Bank. We met with Palestinian leaders, grassroots leaders, women in particular. We met with people who were victims of an unjust incarceration, people whose families had been destroyed in the process of Israeli occupation. We met with people whose land had been stolen, whose houses had been taken away, and who were still on the march for peace and justice for the Palestinian people. And ever since taking that trip, the issue of Palestinian justice has become central in my own activism. So I'm happy to be able to speak to you about some of the things, some of the connections that I saw, and also to provide some historical perspective on the contemporary moment that's happening now. So Malcolm X said that of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. And historians are really happy that he said that, because we agree with that sentiment. And he said, when you see you've got problems, all you have to do is examine the historic method used all over the world by others who have problems similar to yours. And once you see how they got theirs straight, then you'll know how you can get yours straight. Right? He said this in 1963 in one of his most important speeches, Message to the Grassroots. So I want to start off in that spirit by saying this is a talk as much about yesterday as it is about today, with some hints towards a more free and more just tomorrow. So I'm going to cover some of the connections between the NYPD and Israeli security forces in a larger sense, the ways in which activists have begun to bridge connections and travel bridges that have been built by activists in the 50s and 60s between the Palestinian struggle and the struggle for justice for African Americans, and address the question in a larger sense of why race matters, right? So I want to start by talking a little bit about history, the history of race and policing. Well, the first thing to note is that in the law and order equation in this country, black bodies have been the definition of disorder. Controlling black bodies and a profit motive have been deeply rooted in the history of policing in this country. And I think in order to dismantle something, you have to understand its foundation. Because oftentimes in the contemporary debate, there's a lot of discussion about law and order, about the ways in which the police should be treating the citizenry in a larger sense. What is the role of the police in a larger sense? And it's important to think about, well, what are the historic roots of policing in this country? And how far have we come in terms of the connection between race and racial discrimination and where we are today in terms of policing, so that we can understand policing today not as some kind of deviation, but as really an element of continuity around the question of state violence and control of peoples of color. And an ever-expanding realm as more and more people of color come under that framework. Well, Douglas Blackman, in a great book called Slavery by Another Name, he tells the story of men and women who were charged with crimes like vagrancy, who were oftentimes guilty of nothing, who were bought and sold, abused, and subject to deadly working conditions as unpaid convict labor. So while it's common knowledge that enslaved Africans were formally emancipated by the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which said that slavery was unconstitutional, fewer people are aware of the caveat within that which said that slavery was unconstitutional except as punishment for a crime. Now, following the Civil War, you have southern states passing many laws called black codes, an array of interlocking laws essentially designed to criminalize black life, to restrict the economic independence of black people, and to provide pretexts for jail terms. Right? These convicts were then rented off to plantations, to lumber camps, and to mines, and used for forced labor. This is the building of the modern South. Right? This is the foundation of racial capitalism in a lot of ways, and I think it's very important to understand what role the police played in that system. In 1893, Frederick Douglass wrote, quote, "The convict lease system and lynch laws are twin infamies, which flourish hand in hand in many of the United States." This is important because while we're more aware in a contemporary sense of lynching and the role of lynching, we're less aware of the role of convict labor. Douglass went on to say that there are two great outgrowths as a result of the legislation under which our people suffer today. And he identified the states from Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Washington. All of those states who claimed that they were too poor to house prisoners. So the convicts were leased out to work for railroad contractor, mining companies, and those who farmed large plantations. Those companies assumed charge of the convicts, they worked them for cheap labor, and they paid the states a handsome revenue for their labor. The police were an engine of the system that Frederick Douglass described. They were not expected to protect and serve, right? Important. Right, because this is the language that's being used today. Why don't they just do what they're supposed to do? Well, maybe they are, right? They were expected to control black and brown and poor and dispossessed and other bodies defined as deviant. The connection between race, racism, and law enforcement was made clear by the systematic engine that developed that was known as the prison industrial complex. In my own work in Oakland, California, for example, by 1950, the charges of police brutality had become so prevalent that one local newspaper said, "This treatment of Negroes in Oakland has become almost a tradition. It has happened to so many Negroes over and over without any action on the part of the department heads. The feeling has grown that Negroes can look for nothing better at the hands of the police." These words could have been written today. And I think it's important to have the historical perspective where it seems like we're faced with something new that's something old at the same time, right? One of my students wrote in her final exam about this very reality, writing, what does the world have to offer someone like me, black, brown, poor woman? Is it just prison? Now, Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, has written that no other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial or ethnic minorities. The United States imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. Currently, the incarceration rate for black Americans as a whole is a little over 2,200 per 100,000 Americans. In contrast, for whites, it's 380 per 100,000. So it's important to keep the foundations of the system in mind as we think about the connection between the U.S.'s unflinching endorsement of the vicious apartheid of occupation in the West Bank and the role U.S. police forces have played in brutally suppressing protests in the U.S. It's beyond the fact that the tear gas in one place shows up in other places, or the personnel are traveling between these locations. It's really about the political problem that black bodies pose to the U.S. nation state and the political problem that Palestinian bodies pose to the Israeli nation state. It's about conquest and empire, containment and dispossession, and a process of dehumanization. Now, since the beginning of Israeli occupation, if we tie that to 1967, we can say that over 700,000 Palestinians have been detained by the state of Israel. That's about 20% of the total population. Currently, there are over 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners being held in Israeli prisons. Right? The arrest and detention of Palestinians living within the occupied territories is governed by a wide-ranging set of military regulations that govern every aspect of Palestinian civilian life. For example, the army is not obliged to inform a detainee's family of their arrest or the location of their detention. A Palestinian can be arrested for up to 8 days without the Israeli military informing the detainee of the reason for his or her arrest or without being brought in front of a judge. A Palestinian detainee can be interrogated for a total of 188 days, during which he or she may be denied lawyer visits. During the interrogation period, and we have to put interrogation in quotes, right? Because we know that oftentimes brutality and torture occurs during that interrogation period, especially when the people who are being detained are children as well. So there's isolation, there's solitary confinement as well. And I think that's important to note. When we think about the prison conditions, of course, there's overcrowding. And it's really a cruel system in a lot of ways. The quality of food, the blankets, all of the elements of really human existence are denied the people who are imprisoned. And like I mentioned, children play a disproportionate role in these numbers. So approximately 700 Palestinian children are persecuted every year through Israeli military courts as well. And as a matter of fact, one of the connections between the African American struggle and the Palestinian struggle is just the meaning of what childhood is, the parameters of childhood. And the presumption of innocence is not there for Palestinian detainees in the same way that the presumption of innocence is not there for African Americans. They're presumably guilty. You start off being guilty, and then you have to work your way out of that box if you can. The reality is the same for women who oftentimes do not appear in the public image of what a resisting Palestinian looks like or could be like, but who oftentimes women are the backbone of many of these acts of resistance, whether it be daily or organized. And women in particular face sexual harassment, humiliation, beatings, insults, threats as well. Women as mothers in particular play a big role in keeping the names and experiences of their family members and themselves in front of the media and in front of a larger audience so that people can begin to mobilize. Now, in a real sense, all of these experiences of oppression have made visible paths and connections and inroads of community connection between Palestinians and people of African descent in the U.S. And one of the more inspiring things I think that's happening is when that goes from the theoretical to the real, right? Because in a lot of ways, there's something very specific about the types of oppression that these groups are facing. There's something particular about the history that they're facing as well. So one of the more inspiring things I wanted to highlight is that we have organizations from Hands Up United and Black Lives Matter and the Black Youth Project who joined the Dream Defenders recently on a delegation to Palestine to learn about the struggles of the Palestinian people and to build international solidarity across struggles. And of course, there's groups like Muslims for Ferguson, as well as others who are trying to make those connections real, not just theoretical or semantic connections or simple equivalences, but actual struggle and actual knowledge and people sitting down with each other and really hearing what they have to say and building together towards a better world. So the trip was organized by the Dream Defenders legal team and policy director, as well as activists, and the goal of the trip was really to provide for group members to experience and see firsthand the occupation, ethnic cleansing, and brutality Israel has levied against Palestinians. That would be the type of trip that I would wish that politicians in the U.S. would go and experience, that kind of delegation, that kind of trip where they can really have an accurate sense of what is going on, rather than these propaganda, feel-good Zionist projects. In the spirit of Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, and others, they thought the connection between African American leadership of the movement in the U.S. and those on the ground in Palestine needed to be reestablished and fortified. It's important to note that the contemporary connections that people are making today are building on the historic connections that activists during the Black Freedom Movement made between what was happening in a larger sense and the global condition, right? Because in a lot of ways, Malcolm X's quote points to systematic oppression. It points to empire, it points to colonialism. Nothing that is specific to presidential administrations and who's the mayor and how we voted in the last election, but things that are systematic and fundamental to the operation of fundamental aspects of U.S. society. And I think that's important to take away as well, because I think there's a sense for the contemporary moment, the discussion of how to wrangle with the contemporary political scene and how to wage allies and gain concessions, which of course all of that is important, but always important to step back and understand that you may cut off one element of the octopus's tentacle, but there are 7 others to be dealt with. Now, the conversation about police reform, again, needs to push beyond things like cameras and 4-hour retrainings and things like that, because when you're existing in a society that's fundamentally built on discrimination, which fundamentally understands certain bodies to be guilty by assumption and guilty by birth, where Black children are not allowed childhoods, it's hard to imagine that you can retrain that out of someone in 3 hours. So I wanted to just think about restorative justice, because in a lot of ways, that is the true reform movement in terms of thinking about just rethinking how we think about justice. I think it connects to the idea of prison abolition and how to just reimagine our world in a way that allows our full humanity to be expressed and keeps us safe while not tormenting and criminalizing an entire generation, an entire people. Right? So restorative justice is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused or revealed by criminal behavior. Right? So it's a collective process. It's something that is being increasingly discussed in policy circles that are progressive. And it has nothing to do with what we may associate with punishment, such as retribution and things like that, but it's really about restoring justice to the people who have been injured, allowing those who are victimized to participate in that process, and rethinking what the government's role in all of that is. Right? This is very important, I think, in a lot of ways. So I feel like when we think about police reform and where we are in this contemporary moment, that we need to sort of reach back to these historical connections to truly understand what is going on. Because while it may seem like over the past few months, especially over the summer, it felt like a debilitating hail of names and peoples and stories and deaths, and you could turn on YouTube and see people's life being choked out of them with no retribution. You could see children being killed with no seeming, no seeming outcry of humanity. It seemed like a questioning of humanity. I know that over the summer, with all the events that went on, it was a very challenging time to think about where we are as a people on this planet. But important to remember that there was an Eleanor Bumpurs, that there was a Rodney King, there was a Yusuf Hawkins. There were all of these events that also are a part of this history. And in some ways, what we're seeing is a new manifestation of something that has been around for quite a long time. And the question is, how do we challenge that? So when you think about sort of connecting policing in Israel and policing in the U.S., it's really a broad cry, right? Of course, the Israeli Defense Force has things to teach the NYPD and vice versa, right? But how will we really dismantle the societies that make such entities possible? How do we take away power from those who seek to oppress in broad daylight? Because I think that's the thing that made the summer really challenging, was just the visibility of it all, right? You knew things were happening. Of course, there was sort of the violence of daily life. That's what I say. There's the violence of daily life. When you're living in the U.S., there's the violence of daily life in the West Bank, where people are disappeared, arrested. Their lives are totally transformed. Their ability to gain access to natural resources like water are challenged, compromised. And then there's the overt violence when things like military actions happen and the world seems to take notice. Then those things don't happen anymore, and then the news cycle moves on. But what about keeping the focus on the dailiness of it all, right? The structural oppression. So I feel like making this connection between policing in Israel and the U.S. is really important. It's a revolutionary call. It can be a revolutionary call. It could also be a reactionary call around police reform and making sure that the real criminals are the ones that get punished, not us good people over here, right? But instead we have to sort of rethink just who we are, where we are in this particular historical moment, even thinking about the U.S. and its relationship to colonialism as a contemporary situation, as something that's connected to Puerto Rico, to Hawaii, to ongoing projects that are going on, to think about the dispossession of the land One of the things that I always think about when I think about Palestine is just the land. You know, the agriculture of it all, the olive trees, right? The disruption of those things are also a manifestation of violence. So it's really important to sort of connect racism, colonialism, and empire in the U.S. as we're connecting policing in Israel to policing in the United States. Behind the connected dots is a connected history. Dismantling this system is not just a matter of sort of gaining group rights, but about challenging anti-Blackness and coming to terms with the history of enslavement in this country. So Malcolm X said, history is best qualified to reward our research. And when you see you've got problems, all you have to do is examine the historic method used all over the world by others who have problems similar to yours. It's really a call for us to look around, look abroad, and to not imagine that what's happening in the U.S. is some element of exceptionalism, and to really begin to make those connections. And once those connections are made, it's not just an intellectual exercise, but it's a different way of living your life, a different way of interacting with people. And I think that's the revolutionary potential. So I'm going to end there.